Today we are talking about the raid. It's almost been a week since we went over the recap of how things were going in the raid, and guess what? Now the race to World First has just ended, in a greatly disappointing fashion, but still it did. And why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because now the gates are open for Blizzard to rein in the buffs and the nerfs to the specs, because Blizzard was traditionally waiting for the race to end in order to not dramatically impact the result of the race by nerfing or buffing spec right as the guilds are progressing. But now that it is over, we can expect to see varying changes to the specs. So it's nice to go now and look at the situation in the raid. The more overperforming specs perhaps more bound to hit a nerf, and the more underperforming specs in need of some buffs, purely looking by the results in the raid. Also, this is where one of the few cases early on in the season where the raid will be more relevant than Mythic Plus. You know, a few weeks from now, most of the requests for balancing and demands for tuning will be centered around the meta in Mythic Plus. But for now, though, most of the Mythic Plus busyness has been around pushing keys for getting plus 10 gear and crests. There aren't really many pushing groups already live and running in keys, because there are still many, for example, good Mythic Plus players busy raiding with their guilds, for example, or using their characters for the raid rather than their Mythic Plus meta character and whatnot. So for now as well, the balancing will be tuned more in with a focus on the raid more so than Mythic Plus. So we have to go out of the way and immediately point out the elephants in the room, which have been the overperformance. So yes, we are immediately starting by asking for nerfs. The overperformance of two specs in particular in this tier, Fire Mage and Windwalker Monk. So the race to World First has just ended. Liquid just got to World First, pretty much all of the bosses, and it started on a pretty off-base way with sticks, where you see the need of spread cleave, so you start seeing triple Shadow Priest and triple Balance Druid. But even then, despite going for this kind of cleave, they still made sure to have double Windwalker, double Fire Mage. Then you move into Sprocketmonger, it's double Windwalker, double Fire Mage. And then it's double Windwalker, double Fire Mage. And up to this point, you're saying, well, but you know, I also saw 3 Shadow Priests and 2 Shadow Priests and 3 Shadow Priests. So, you know, that means that Shadow Priest is just as OP, just as good as them. As soon as you move into Magzi, Shadow Priests are completely gone. Now it's 2 Windwalkers and 3 Fire Mage. And then you get in the last boss, and it's triple Windwalker, quadruple Fire Mage. You literally have 14 DPS and 7 are Windwalker or Mage. 50% of all of your DPS in here were either Windwalker or Fire Mage. Now this is a combination of two things: the utility brought by these two specs and classes in general for quite a few of these bosses, as well as their current damage. Right now, Fire is in the top 6 and Windwalker is flat out first in results. And don't forget that these are only the results of the first 4 bosses, because right now, with the progression being halted so much by sticks, you have basically no logs right now from Sprocketmonger onwards. So those are even only the results of the first 4 bosses in Mythic, which means that they are bound to have some of these frauds lose in damage by quite a lot as we get into later and later bosses. For example, things like Destruction Warlock or even things like Affliction Warlock. Some of these won't work nearly as well on latter bosses. You know, being able to inflate your results even there, like for example Cauldron of Carnage, being able to split your damage with multi-dotting or with using Havoc as a Destro lock on this fight in particular, which leads to you know, being at the top on this fight, won't really work in the further bosses. So of course, the more you go past Cauldron, the value of Destro will fall lower and lower as you keep going further and further in the progression. But what will not fall further and further lower down will be Fire Mage and will be Windwalker. So not only right now do they have very good damage, what has given them this value on multiple bosses has also been their utility, in particular their tankiness to survive some of the brutal damage that the raid is receiving on the latter bosses, and more importantly their utility. Some of the latter bosses, like Sprocketmonger, requires massive amount of movement, precise movement, but movement nonetheless, throughout the conveyor belt tracks, which helps a lot, makes it much easier for mobile specs like Monk and Mage. Even more movement is required on Magzi, and some cheating of movement with blinks, which mages of course have about 57 of, and monks can still use with Transcendence. Same goes for Galliwix. So it was a combination, it still is a combination of the current utility of mobility of both Windwalker and Fire Mage. Fire Mage is also an outlier in terms of defensiveness, having access to mirror image, to even invisibility to cheese some mechanics, as well as alter time, multiple charges of blinks and displacements. You have a cheat death, you have a personal barrier, you have a mass barrier, you have Ice Cold as a 70% damage reduction defensive, which if you feel like, you can still turn back to your good old ice block immunity. So they're just way overpacked with defensiveness, which highlights of course just how problematic the spec is once you also give them top damage. It is par for the course, of course, yet another PTR cycles where certain mages in certain neighborhoods tried to claim that once again Mage was average, once again Fire Mage was nothing special, or in this current patch, once again, the only problem is Mage having broken bracers or a broken weapon, making them this good. Not at all. Fire Mage is broken OP and needs to be nerfed practically everywhere, not just their damage, but also their mobility and their defensiveness. Perhaps the situation might be slightly different for Windwalker, right? Windwalker, even in this current OP state, for example, if you look at the parses, this raid in Mythic is still comfortably middle of the pack. You know, there are still plenty of melee players going Ret, going Havoc, even going Warrior before thinking about going Windwalker, despite Windwalker being this good right now. And perhaps maybe also the reason why not many players are so up in arms about the power of Windwalker right now in the raid, because it's not nearly as prevalent, or hasn't been nearly as prevalent historically in the meta as Mage has, in particular Fire Mage. And then of course, to make things even worse, yes, we're talking about the raid for today, but Fire Mage is also in prime position to be the meta spec in Mythic Plus as well, not just the raid. So, talking about top specs, guaranteed nerfs coming for Fire Mage. Perhaps Windwalker, maybe just some slight damage, not much more though, or at least not nearly as much as Fire. Now, before talking about the rest of the DPS, we still have to mention the other spring green color doing very well this tier, because it's Mistweaver. Now, it's interesting because Mistweaver in terms of results is bang in the middle of three other specs: Resto Druid, Discipline Priest, and the perhaps more surprising Resto Shaman. Now, Mistweaver has been stacked for similar reasons as Windwalker. They still have their advantages of mobility over other healers. The only one who got close is Preservation Evoker in terms of mobility, but they would lack the consistent HPS and the style of healing that Mistweaver has. Mistweaver, just in general, doesn't really have anything particularly out of order, despite being this good or being played this much. It's not really due to their HPS. It's not like a situation like Windwalker or like Fire Mage where they simply do more than other specs in terms of damage. Mistweaver in that sense is just fine. They have been lucky enough since Dragonflight to get a very permissive and a very enthusiastic lead dev, which has showered them in quality of life buffs and improvements for their spec, made possible to run both the caster build and the fist weaving build more and more, better and better, to the point that now even in the raid you can play Chi-Ji and fist weaving, or Yulon and casting monk just the same as well. It's been improved in tons of ways. It's very good. As a joke, what Mistweaver monks have been saying since Dragonflight, this is the best version of Mistweaver that has ever been, and every patch is repeated because it gets better. But in terms of healing, in terms of pure numbers, if we were expecting a nerf, really their only problem is this thing right here. If you gave the mana passive Shaman has, Resurgence, to Monk, and then you gave the mana T ability of Monk to Shaman, right now Monk would be around Holy Priest level, and Resto Shaman would be close to being out of this picture, because that is really all there is for healers in the raid. It's mana. Mistweaver is able to get to this level because of their non-existent mana problems. If you allowed in a group, for example, with 0 available druids to give Innervate to Discipline Priest, if you still allowed Discipline Priest to have the mana to go for 20 men ramps every 30 seconds, they would also gain some 20+% more healing. If you allowed Shaman to finally be able to just use chain heal every single time they have it buffed by tidal waves without having to worry about their mana, they would also gain several amounts of percentages of healing done more than what they have now. They simply can't do this because they don't have the mana. That is really perhaps the only thing you would want to look at in terms of nerfing Mistweaver Monk when it comes to healing. Just their mana, not the way it actually works or the way it actually plays. Beyond that, sure, we can also nerf the damage. Currently the damage of Mistweaver Monk is just out of line and should be put more in line with the rest of the healers. And yes, there is always the same debate, should we nerf this one or should we buff everyone else to be at the same level of this one? Yeah, technically it would be better to buff everyone else, but it's obviously just simpler to nerf the damage. Mostly, generally speaking, crackling Jade Lightning damage pretty much is what should be put back in line a little bit more. Then of course you have the other point, which is the buffs. Okay, we have talked about the ones doing well, but what about Holy Priest and Holy Paladin and Preservation Evoker? A lot of it also has to do with simply the presence. All of the top healers, most of the top healers in top guilds are simply not playing those three specs. So if you took all of the very good healers playing the Flavor of the Month specs and put them into Holy Priest, Holy Paladin and Preservation Evoker, likely their numbers would be better than what you see now, for example. But even then, definitely there should be some bumped up in numbers, especially for Holy Paladin and for likely Holy Priest. Especially Holy Priest, because Holy Priest is kind of doing what Mistweaver Monk does, except Mistweaver Monk just does it better. Plus it's tankier, plus it's more mobile, basically it's just better everywhere else. But for Holy Priest, at the very least, looking at the glass half full, it's mostly just a matter of throughput percentages. Just buff their abilities by a few percentages. For Holy Paladin, it would be more of a mechanical issue, a rotational issue for the entire spec. That would be a bit harder to fix in just a 10% more Light of Dawn and 15% more Holy Shock healing kind of buff coming in a patch. With Preservation Evoker having kind of the same situation of Holy Priest, it's not that their entire kit is wrong or bad or faulty. In fact, we have touched on this, Preservation Evoker has been improved in practically every way in this patch, and it's not bad by any means. It's just being overshadowed at the moment by what we said would happen. Whenever you look at Discipline Priest and Preservation Evoker, the one that is best is going to win out, because they do very similar things, which is big bursty healing in 1 to 1.5 minute intervals, and in this case Discipline Priest is winning. So the bigger outliers in here are the buffs perhaps needed for Holy Priest and Holy Paladin, and then the nerfs, although not that hard honestly for Mistweaver, and more so about their mana conservation and their damage rather than their actual healing numbers. Now back to the damage. We talked about the one doing well being Windwalker and being Fire Mage. We have also seen a lot of room for multi-dotting and spread cleaving good results for Shadow Priest. That is kind of expected, it's kind of their niche, as well as at times Affliction Warlock, as well as Destruction Warlock, depending on the fight. Rogues have continued to do consistently well. What is more impressive is that all of the specs of Rogue have been doing well. All of the specs of Rogue have been played. All of the specs of Rogue have been viable, which is not the same as you can see from the other multi-spec classes like Warlocks and Mages and Hunters. There is generally one clear winner and the others are kind of much lower down. Not the case for Rogues, so it will be quite good for the spec as a whole, for you to feel like you can play different things depending on the fight. For example, just go and look at the top results right now for Rogue. You go to Vexy and it's like Outlaw, Outlaw, Assassination, Sub, Assa, Sub, Outlaw, Sub. And then you get to Cauldron, more of the same. What a surprise, where there is a clear winner is when, as mentioned, one of the niche damage profile shines, which is Rick Reverb, and that is the funnel AoE consistent damage as well from Sub, which from the ads of Rick Reverb they gain a lot of that, which is why they are doing much better on Rick, and then more funnel damage on Styx, because again of the ads. The Rogue is practically doing his normal rotation and gets a free 1.1 million DPS from Nimble Flurry, for example. That's how good it is to have this kind of damage profile for sub, which is overall the one that can gain the most in this raid because of this damage profile. These numbers will go down a bit for sub because the next bosses that will start getting shown in the results will be Sprocket, where it has no funnel damage, One Arm Bandit, which also doesn't really have a lot of funnel damage at all, as well as Magzi, also very little to no funnel damage there. So it's bound to go down a bit more, but rogues in general are still doing well. The demise of Enhancement Shaman because of the nerfs has been greatly exaggerated. It is still doing just fine as a spec, still amongst the highest of the results. Who has been more predictably butchered by the last minute nerfs to the spec in its entirety was Elemental. And that's where we move to talk about the bad ones. The specs doing bad right now, talking about buffs, right? We can agree to some nerfs to Windwalker, major nerfs to Fire Mage, perhaps sprinkled in some damage maybe to their multi-dotting cleave shenanigans for Shadow Priest, but besides that, specs at the top don't seem to be overperforming nearly as much. However, when we go to the bottom is where you start thinking a little bit more. Because you have Balance Druid, Elemental Shaman, you have practically all of the Hunter specs, Frost Mage, Arcane Mage, Red Paladin, as well as both of the DK specs. Now, is this all bad? Is this all depression? Or is there some silver lining which makes these specs actually better than what they look like in these results? In the case of Arcane and in the case of Frost, it's a case of being overshadowed by a much better performing spec at the moment, which is Fire. Same thing we said about the healers. If you took all of the top Fire mages right now, of course playing Fire because it's the best, and you put them into Arcane, no doubt the actual performance of Arcane would go up by at least 5% more damage, possibly more, simply because better players overall are playing the spec. Even with that in mind though, Arcane is underperforming compared to Fire Mage by about 4 to 5% anyways, so Fire Mage would be the better one anyways. The one that are more surprising perhaps, at least according to maths, at least according to AI, at least according to a robot performing these damage rotations is DK, because at the moment both Frost and Unholy have very good simulated single target damage, very good potential damage in single target. Now, to be fair, we are only, once again, to repeat, seeing the results in here of the first 4 bosses, which aren't exactly single target damage. The first boss has a bunch of adds. Cordon of Carnage is split into 2 and range DPS can abuse the range to hit both. You have Rick Reaver, which got a ton of adds spawning, Styx, even more adds spawning. So when you actually get to see more single target is in the fights that are not being logged yet, because Sprocketmonger is literally the only single target fight in the entire raid. And then you have One Arm Bandit, which only has 3 adds spawning and are not that relevant to kill. They are spread, there's not a lot of cleave going on there, and single target damage would still be the more relevant damage profile for this fight. You have Magzi then, which is still also very heavy on single target, because even with the Gowls spawning and the Galagio goons inside, that's still single target. And then when the mines spawn, those are, ignored. You don't actually damage them. And then the small adds, the copters that spawn, they spawn 1 at a time, 1 or 2 at a time, depending on if you mess up the frontal. So it's, again, very little damage, very little AoE damage you do there. So it's very single target heavy. So some of the specs here performing well in single target didn't have nearly as much of a chance to do well, to show up well in these first 4 bosses being logged. This is to say, for a dose of hopium, things might get better in a couple of weeks as more of the latter bosses start getting logged and we see more of the supposedly better performing single target specs showing up. We're talking about Frost DK, Unholy DK, we are talking about Devastation Evoker as well as Beast Mastery Hunter and Demolock as well. Those are the specs that might grow in their overall results as we go deeper into the raid. But I don't think those would be in any need of any buffs right now. There's also other tough questions, for example, balance. Yes, we see balance doing very poorly, or even Elemental Shaman doing very poorly, right? But as we have seen from Mythic Plus, we have also seen that both of these specs are blasting their AoE damage in Mythic Plus right now. So this is a classic case of the debate of would you be okay with being somewhat poor in the raid because you don't have great single target or cleave damage, but be much more relevant or even meta in some cases in Mythic Plus if you have top level damage for AoE, right? That could be one of the cases for both Elemental and Balanced Druid. There are many of these trades you might or might not accept. For example, at the moment, Destro, despite showing up quite high, Destro is barely simming above Protection Warrior in single target damage. The only reason why, as we mentioned, they are quite high up is because of the cleave, Havoc, multi-target damage they are able to have in logs for now. Same goes for Affliction. Affliction is woeful in their single target damage. So even if they can abuse some multi-target in the raid right now, they would still need some damage increase, especially in single target. Affliction, Destruction, Assassination Rogue, as mentioned, Arcane Mage, Balanced Druid, those possibly are still in need in some help when it comes to their single target damage and overall damage in the raid, more so than their AoE in Mythic Plus. So that's the case when it comes to DPS, after going through both the healer and the DPS and to try to figure out which ones are more in need of some buffs and which ones are more in need or more likely to receive a bunch of nerfs in the, I guess, very close, imminent set of balance tuning post Race to World First. Whether it will be this Friday before the weekend or on Tuesday before the reset, it's very likely we will get to one, at least the first initial one after, at this point, a couple of weeks into the patch. But for today, I guess this was the possible predictions of what will happen in terms of tuning before the next reset. It is when we can stop for today. So with this being said, we can leave each other on this Monday by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's a bit too sunny. We are above 15 degrees. That's a bit too high up for March, to be honest.